Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a massive, frankly epic historical journey. We're looking at exactly how the rule of law was forged against the flames of tyranny. This is a 2,500-year-old story of resistance, of brilliant political architecture, and it totally shaped the modern world. It's a heritage handed down to us that we still absolutely rely on today.
Here's our roadmap for the explainer today. We'll start by defining and rejecting tyranny. Then look at taming the English crown, the American constitutional synthesis, a global wave of constitutions, decolonization and universal rights, and finally, safeguarding this modern legacy. Let's just jump right in. Section 1, Defining and Rejecting Tyranny. We are starting way back in ancient Greece and Rome.
So, we begin in a classic era where the very vocabulary of human freedom and, crucially, the warnings against losing it were first written down. You know, one of the most foundational concepts in all of Western political thought is the rule of law. It's the simple, but at the time, completely revolutionary principle that no individual, not even a king or a Roman emperor, stands above the law. Ancient thinkers like Plato recognized tyranny as a deep, fundamental corruption of legitimate government. In fact, in his work, The Republic, Plato described the tyrant as a ruler utterly consumed by his own appetite, someone who actively destroys the state's justice. Ultimately, this ancient concept established a universal standard. It created this incredibly powerful benchmark against which all subsequent generations would measure their rulers and their political institutions. Now, Aristotle actually sat down and systematically categorized these systems in his work, Politics. He contrasted three legitimate forms of government, monarchy, aristocracy, and polity, directly against their corrupted counterparts, tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy. What's absolutely crucial here is that Aristotle made it abundantly clear that a government's legitimacy relies entirely on rule by law. It cannot simply be driven by the individual will or the appetite of the ruler. But here is the thing. These ancient societies didn't just sit around theorizing in forums. They took physical, often highly dangerous action against unchecked authority. The sheer fear of one-man rule profoundly shaped their institutions. This era was marked by rapid physical liberation. In 510 BC, Athens actually drove out the tyrant Hippias, which led to democratic reforms designed specifically to prevent any single individual from ever seizing permanent power again. And then, just 1 year later, in 509 BCE, Rome overthrew its very last king, Tarquinius Superbus. That dramatic overthrow of the Roman king, well, that became the legendary founding myth of the Roman Republic. Romans came to regard kingship itself as a literal form of tyranny. And this is exactly why, in 44 BCE, the senators who killed Julius Caesar, led by well-known figures like Brutus and Cassius, framed his assassination as an act of tyrannicide. To them, it wasn't just murder, right? It was a strictly necessary act of political liberation to save the republic from one-man rule.
Moving to Section 2, Taming the English Crown. Let's fast forward to medieval England.
Over the span of about 4 centuries, we see the clearest institutional expressions of resistance to tyranny emerging in England. Just look at how this built up over time. In 1215, English barons famously backed King John into a corner and forced him to seal the Magna Carta at Runnymede. This firmly established that a king couldn't just arbitrarily imprison subjects or impose taxes without consent. Over time, Parliament emerged as a real counterweight to royal authority. This was heavily reinforced in 1679 by the Habeas Corpus Act, which protected everyday subjects from unlawful detention, and eventually the English Bill of Rights in 1689. That document formally, permanently limited royal power following the Glorious Revolution.
But wow, perhaps the most jarring moment in this entire English timeline happened in 1649, right at the climax of the English Civil War. Establishing that a king could be held legally accountable was a monumental shift. The execution of King Charles I was a radical, undeniable assertion that a monarch is absolutely subject to the law. It forever altered the balance of royal authority. It proved that the rule of law suddenly had real teeth.
All right, Section 3, the American Constitutional Synthesis. We're looking at the 1787 U.S. Constitution.
The founders of the American Republic were, frankly, unusually well-read men. They were constantly looking back to these classical and Enlightenment sources. The 1787 United States Constitution is one of history's most consequential documents, not because it invented these ideas out of thin air, but because it synthesized them. It's like a giant puzzle coming together.
Thomas Jefferson drew on John Locke's theory of natural rights. Alexander Hamilton looked heavily to the Roman Senate. They combined Aristotle's mixed government, Roman republicanism, natural law from Cicero and Aquinas, and Enlightenment principles of consent into one functional, brilliantly designed governing framework.
And drawing straight from Montesquieu's analysis of the British Constitution, the framers literally embedded the rejection of tyranny right into the architecture of the government itself. They instituted checks and balances, a bicameral Congress, and a completely independent judiciary. The entire goal was to ensure no single branch could ever dominate the others, safeguarding the brand new nation against concentrated power.
James Madison, who had personally studied dozens of historical republics, including Athens and Rome, articulated this perfectly in the Federalist Papers. He realized that, well, government is just a reflection of human nature, right? So you actually have to pit human ambitions against one another to preserve liberty. As he famously wrote in Federalist Note 51, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The system wasn't built on this naive hope that leaders would always be angels. It was built on the extremely practical assumption that they absolutely wouldn't be.
Section 4. A global wave of constitutions.
These Enlightenment ideas spread like wildfire, fueling a massive global wave of constitutionalism. The American Revolution of 1776 and the French Revolution of 1789 both drew on these really deep historical concepts of the consent of the governed and natural rights. By 1791, France had adopted its first written constitution, and this wave for sure didn't stop in the 18th century. Fast forward to the aftermath of World War II. The defeated Axis powers were explicitly rebuilt on these exact constitutional foundations. Under Allied supervision, Japan adopted a new constitution in 1947, and Germany adopted its basic law in 1949. It proved beyond a doubt that constitutionalism was becoming the new global standard.
And this legacy literally leaps across oceans. Throughout the 19th century, these very ideas served as a massive blueprint for leaders who were actively dismantling European empires. Nations like Venezuela, Colombia, and Argentina wrote constitutions modeled in part on the U.S. example. Legendary historical figures like Simón Bolívar directly drew on this global constitutional theory to draft governments for newly independent Latin American nations.
Which brings us to Section 5. Decolonization and universal rights in the mid-20th century. Western constitutional ideas had a huge hand in shaping the decolonization of Africa and Asia between the 1940s and 60s. Nations adapted these classical concepts to create entirely new, highly protective democratic frameworks. For example, India's 1950 constitution, which is actually among the world's longest, brilliantly combined British parliamentary traditions, the U.S. Bill of Rights, and Irish models. Later on, Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress utilized universal human rights to completely dismantle the system of apartheid, drafting the 1996 South African Constitution. Today, that document is widely regarded as one of the most rights-protective constitutions ever written.
The sheer scale of this is just breathtaking. To put that into perspective, today, more than 100 nations operate under written constitutions that draw in some measure on the exact principles first articulated in ancient Greece and Rome, refined through Judeo-Christian moral thought, and transmitted straight through the Enlightenment.
Finally, Section 6, Safeguarding the Modern Legacy. Because this system is definitely facing some modern strain. The hard truth is, tyranny didn't just magically disappear with the old kings and emperors. It just evolved. Today, we face a major challenge known as democratic backsliding. This is a really insidious process where duly elected leaders gradually weaken judicial independence, suppress free speech, or slowly undermine electoral integrity. The sources note that in the 21st century, this has occurred in places ranging from Hungary to Venezuela. It's a stark reminder showing us that constitutional norms can actually be quite fragile if they aren't actively maintained. International organizations are tracking this decline in political freedom worldwide very closely, and they are consistently reminding us of the essential safeguards required to stop it. We're talking about robust civic education, strong and free press institutions, and active daily participation in democratic life. These three pillars aren't just nice-to-haves, right? They are literally the immune system of our political freedom.
So, that brings us to the end of our explainer today. I want to leave you with one final, really vital thought. Preserving this 2,500-year-old heritage requires our absolute vigilance today, just as much as it required the physical courage of the ancients in Athens and Rome. The rule of law is literally only as strong as the people willing to uphold it. So the question is, as inheritors of this legacy, are we prepared to actively defend it against the evolving tyranny of our own time?